صل على محمد وآل محمد.
My dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
عليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Thank you for joining us today, and you will forgive me for last week. Sometimes a person's workload becomes so much he doesn't even know what needs to be done. Inshallah, today we'll be starting a new series of discussion. And the discussion will center around the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because that is a very important discussion. It is a primary discussion. It only makes sense to talk about the existence of God. It only makes sense to talk about the attributes of God, to talk about prophets of God, and to talk about the Day of Judgment once you have established for yourself the existence of God. For if you have not established that, the rest of the discussions are really secondary or not relevant at all. But did you know that there were other discussions which are even more primary to the question on the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And there are other sciences, other than Islamic theology, other than Kalam, that rise up to the occasion in trying to answer some of these fundamental questions that you need to ask before you can even start thinking about the proofs for the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So today's lecture is going to be a little bit anticlimactic because I'm really not trying to draw any conclusions today. I'm just trying to set up the framework for our discussion, talk about what are some of the important questions that we need to ask, and also talk about what are some of those fields within Muslim academia that deal with answering some of these questions. We'll draw up a framework today. You'll kind of see where we're trying to go, but if you don't draw any conclusions today, don't be too worried about that, inshallah. You see the title of the paper that you have in your hand. Is it possible to know God? So that's, I think, a very loaded question because it's got two questions in one. The first is it possible to know the existence of God? And the second question is it possible to know the attributes of God? Of course, in the paper that you have in front of you, and for the next few months, we will be talking about the first question. Is it possible to know the existence of God? Before I jump into that question, I just want to make two more clarifications. And the first clarification is this, that now we've entered a purely intellectual argument, meaning that scriptural proofs or divine revelation do not have any direct role to play in these arguments. In talking about the existence of God, you cannot pull out proofs from the Quran and use them directly. Whenever the Quran talks about these issues, it always taps into the human intellect. It tries to revive human reasoning because the only way you can believe and answer these questions is through your own reasoning. So the Quran often will ask, أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ? Do you not use your intellect? أَفَلَا تَتَدَبَّرُونَ? Do you not contemplate over it? Because if you use these scriptural proofs, what happens is you fall into a cyclical argument or a very vicious cycle. So it works this way. For example, let's say we're discussing the very existence of God, and I ask you, well, how do you know God exists? You would tell me that it is because the Quran says so. Or, for example, in Christian tradition, you would say, it is because the Bible says so. And what's my next question going to be to you? How do you know that the Quran is true or the Bible is true? And what will you say? What will I say? Because God revealed it. And what's my next question? How do you know God exists? And then the next question is going to be, because the Quran said so. And how do you know the Quran is a valid book? Because God revealed it. Well, how do you know God exists? And you see that there's a cyclical argument. You've got two arguments that are interdependent on each other without any one of them or each of them being proven independent of each other. And such cyclical arguments simply do not work. So even before we come to any Quranic proofs, we first have to use our intellect and our reasoning for that argument. So if you just follow me in the page that I have in front of you, okay, I'm just going to run through this so that we all are kind of following the text as well. One of the most primary discussions in Islamic theology, of course, is the discussion on the arguments or the evidence for the existence of God. It is a discussion that dates back in Islamic theology, the time of Imam al-Sad and Imam al-Baqir as well. So don't think that atheism is a very new phenomenon. It is not. back then even, after Greek texts were translated into Arabic, you had the occurrence of a new movement called the Dahriyun, the materialists, or the Zanadi, who you would term as, atheists back then. Okay? The discussion is also a purely intellectual discussion. Divine revelation cannot be employed directly as a proof for the existence of God, as it would be tantamount to a circular argument. The third point I've also already made is that, look, the discussion surrounds the very existence of God. Now, when you're talking to somebody, don't think that the only reason a person doesn't believe in the existence of God is because he doesn't have the proofs for the existence of God. Sometimes a person may not believe in the existence of God because there are other proofs and other arguments that have convinced them otherwise. For example, the problem of theosophy, the problem of evil, represents a major challenge and a major block for people to believe in the existence of God, right? People say, if God exists, then how come there is so much evil in this world? If God is merciful, then how come there is so much wrong happening in this world? Okay? But these arguments, they don't create a problem for the existence of God. Here's where we need to be a little subtle about our thinking. They don't create a problem for the existence of God. They do create a problem for some of the attributes of God. And I want to make a distinction between the two. So yes, they will question the mercy of God. They will question the justice of God, and maybe indirectly lead to questioning the very existence of God. But primarily, they don't question the existence of God. They question some of the attributes of God. In the paper that you have in front of you, in the next few months, I want to talk about those arguments which either prove or negate the existence of God. Okay? Now, when we talk about the existence of God, one of the most important questions that does come up, even before you start talking about it, is it possible to know? Can we even know whether God exists or not? Are human beings capable of answering that question? Do we have enough intellectual capacity? Do we have enough information in front of us to be able to answer that question, or not to be able to answer that question? See, sometimes you talk to a person, they tell you, I don't believe in God because I have got strong proof to suggest that God does not exist. Such a person is called a strong atheist. Sometimes a person comes up to you and says, well, I don't have any proof for the non-existence of God, but at the same time, I don't have any proof for the existence of God. Such a person is called a weak atheist. But sometimes you'll come across a person and you'll ask them, well, does God exist or not? And he will simply say to you, well, I don't know, and I don't think it is possible for human beings to know. Such a person is known as an agnostic. Good, excellent. So coming back to our notes that you have in front of you, agnosticism, as defined by the Encyclopedia Britannica, for the lack of any other encyclopedias, strictly speaking, the doctrine that humans cannot know of the existence of anything beyond the phenomena of their experience. So only things which are experiential, that are experienced by the senses, the five senses, those have a truth value to them, and those things which cannot be directly experienced by the five senses, no truth value can be associated to them. Okay. The term has come to be equated in popular parlance with skepticism, so not just question about the knowledge of the existence of God, but any knowledge per se, okay? Especially about religious questions in general, in particular with the rejection of the traditional Christian beliefs under the impact of modern scientific thought, and continues. Okay. From an Islamic perspective, before we jump into an intellectual discussion, do you think it is possible to know of the existence of God, or is it not possible to know of the existence of God? You can speak. I'm going to rest right now. Well, I think the answer is obvious for us. It is possible, we believe, to know of the existence of God. So you mean to say that we can comprehend God? Are you agnostic or an agnostic?
Comprehend basically means like you know and you sort of have a complete knowledge of it.
Mm-hmm.
which is not possible, but you can have something like.
So if somebody were to ask you, are you agnostic or are you an agnostic? How would you answer that question?
I think we should separate the concept of God or attribute of God with entity of God.
Okay.
We can know the attribute and the concept of God, but we cannot know the entity of God.
You mean the essence of God?
Essence.
The that of God.
Exactly.
Okay, okay. Sister, let me go.
Yeah, I think there's also the point of to what extent you can know God.
Okay.
And to a complete extent, but maybe, as the brother mentioned, you can know certain attributes.
Okay, good, good. So we do believe that we can know about the existence of God. All human beings have the capability of knowing and answering that question, but we cannot know everything about God. But the important conclusion to take away from this is just because we don't know everything about God doesn't mean that we can't know something about God. That's very important, right? Because, for example, when, a century ago they were studying the atom, right? They didn't know about, for example, electrons and protons, all right? They just knew that they were atoms in general, okay? Or maybe 10, 20 years after that, they came to learn about electrons and protons, but they didn't really know about quarks and the different flavors and types of quarks that are there. Or later on, when they came to know about that, they didn't really know about, substring theory or string theory, right? But just because they didn't know the details of the atom did not mean that those things which they said about the atom were wrong, or that they could not know something about the atom. They could. We say the same of God. We can know about God, but we don't claim to know everything about God, okay? In fact, it's very interesting. One of the reasons for why God has created us, according to Islamic traditions, is so that we should know Him, right? So I think one of the questions all of us often ask ourselves is, why did God create us? Kids will ask you, you will have asked yourself, people in general ask, it's probably the most important question out there, why did God create us? And I often point out to some of my students that, look, this is two questions loaded into one question, right? So the first question is, what did God want to benefit for Himself out of the act of creation? And then the second question is, well, whatever He wanted to benefit for Himself, that aside, what does He want us to do on this earth? What is our purpose and goal on the face of this earth? Unless you distinguish these two questions, you will get very confused when trying to answer them. So, for example, sometimes when people don't make this distinction, a child comes and asks them, why did God create us? They remember that very important verse in the Quran which says, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. Well, God created us because He wanted us to worship Him. Then the next question that he asks is, well, why does God need us to worship Him? And then the father has a difficulty answering that question. But if you realize there are two separate questions, the first one is, well, what benefit did God want from creation? On that first question, we're very clear that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, anytime, let's not even talk about Allah right now, let's talk about any human being. We say a wise human being always has a purpose in whatever he does, right? This morning when you woke up, you came to university, there was a reason for it, right? What was the reason? You wanted to acquire knowledge. Or if you wake up and you go to work in the morning, there's a reason for it. And the reason for that is you want to acquire some money for yourself. There has to be some benefit in it for yourself as well. Well, did you ever think that any time you assume a benefit, you also have to assume a defect as well, right? The reason you came to study is because you didn't have that knowledge. If you had that knowledge, you wouldn't have come. The reason why you go to work to acquire money is because you don't have that money. If you had that money, you wouldn't bother to wake up in the morning, right? If you assume any personal benefit for God, at the same time you also have to assume a defect for God. And you cannot assume a defect for God. And therefore God does not create because there is a personal benefit to Him. He creates because that is who He is. He is Al-Khaliq, the creator. He doesn't need any external reasons for Him to engage in creation. He is Al-Jawad, He is the generous. He doesn't need any other reason besides who He is to act in to engage in the act of generosity, of giving existence to things, right? Like sugar, nobody asks why sugar is sweet. That is what sugar is, by definition sweet. Why does God create? Doesn't have to be a reason for that. That is who God is. He is the creator and the generous one. But coming to the second question now, whatever that reason was, why did God create us? Meaning, what is our purpose and goal in life? Well, there you can say, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. Our purpose is to worship God. Now, on that note, we come to the hadith that's in front of you. From, I believe, the third Imam, عن أبي عبد الله, from the sixth Imam, قال خرج الحسين بن علي, Hussein, the son of Ali, the son of Abi Talib, على أصحابه, came out in the presence of his companions. فقال, then he said, أيها الناس. You don't have the Arabic, but you do have the English, so just follow me in the English. Page 1, it's the font is centered. Yeah, just before the definition of agnosticism. أيها الناس, O people, إن الله جل ذكره, surely God, may His remembrance be exalted, ما خلق العباد إلا ليعرفوه. He has not created His creatures except for one purpose. This purpose is not for His benefit. This purpose is our purpose in life. Our purpose is ليعرفوه, so that they may come to know Him, to understand Him, to know of Him. فَإِذَا عَرَفُوهُ عَبَدُوهُ. When they understand Him, they will worship Him. Which shows you that in Islam, ma'rifat, knowledge, comes before ibadat, worship. That worship is called a worship. That worship is valuable. That comes after knowledge, and that is preceded with knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? فَإِذَا عَبَدُوهُ اسْتَغْنَوْا بِعِبَادَتِهِ عَنْ عِبَادَةِ مَا سِوَاهُ. And then when they worship Him, then they have no need to worship anyone besides Him. Now, coming back to the question of agnosticism. Can we know whether God exists or not? In Muslim academia, there are two sciences that rise up to the occasion in trying to answer this question. I don't call them Islamic sciences because they're not really Islamic sciences. They precede the whole discussion on Islam. They are fundamental philosophical discussions. But I call them sciences which are discussed in Muslim academia. Secondly, when I use the word science for them, don't think this is science in contrast to humanities. Here in this page, whenever I use the word science, I mean a body of knowledge, a field of study. So there are two fields of study that rise up to the occasion to answer this question. The first field of study is known as the field of mantiq. Mantiq meaning logic or rationality. Okay? And mantiq is defined as that field of study that gives you the tools that you need to be able to think and draw up correct conclusions. Meaning that if you were to use these tools and practice these tools properly, you would protect yourself from drawing the wrong conclusions. Traditionally, in Islamic logic, or logic that was discussed in Muslim academia, they followed Aristotelian logic. Okay? And Aristotelian logic talked about different ways of proving or reasoning certain arguments. Talked about three primary ways of reasoning. The first one was deductive reasoning, which is called qiyas in Arabic. This is not the qiyas of fiqh, this is the qiyas of mantiq. Qiyas, deductive reasoning, also known as a syllogism. The other was inductive reasoning, and in Arabic that is, anybody? It's istiqra, right? The third one was tamthil. And tamthil would be translated as the use of analogy. Hope I spelled it right. Okay. Now, even though Aristotle and Muslim scholars, they talked about different ways of reasoning and argument, the most important way was the use of qiyas, of syllogisms. Okay. What's a qiyas? Can anybody give me an example of a qiyas? Without looking at your notes.
A is B, B is C.
Exactly. So there are different forms of syllogisms. But the most basic form and the most important form of a syllogism is exactly what you told me right now. Look, if A is B and B is C, therefore it follows that A is also C, all right? And I just want to put up an example on the board. I just want us to talk about it a little bit. This will form the heart and soul of our discussions on the proofs for the existence of God, and how do we know that those proofs are true, and how do we know that the conclusions that we draw have actually a truth value to them or not. So one thing I didn't talk about as I was leading up to this discussion is, inshallah, in the next few months, we want to talk about our three primary proofs for the existence of God. The first is the argument by design, or also known as the teleological argument. In Arabic or Farsi, it is known as Burhane Nazm. Good. The second one is the cosmological argument. Okay. So the first one, the teleological argument, the reason I'm bringing all of this up is because I'm leading towards something that will come up in the teleological argument. There was a philosopher and thinker in the 17th century by the name of David Hume. Hume wrote a very important criticism of the teleological argument. And at the heart of the criticism was his proposition that the teleological argument is based on empiricism. Now, for us to be able to break down his argument, and then for us to be able to criticize his argument, and it's a very powerful argument, okay? We really have to understand what's just about to come right now, okay? The second argument that we want to give for the existence of God is the cosmological argument. The argument also known as Burhane Imkan Wujud, and the third one is Burhane Fitrat, the proof by innate disposition. But coming back to qiyas, an example of qiyas is the one that you have in front of you. The minor premise states that, look, Socrates is a human being. Major premise is what? Is that all human beings, and usually major premises are universal, so they are preceded by all human beings are mortal. And then the conclusion drawn there is that, well, poor Socrates is mortal. Okay, now my question to you is, for this argument to be valid, what has to be valid?
Major premise.
Okay, so you know what? The major premise has to be valid. What else has to be valid? The minor premise has to be valid. What else has to be valid? Sorry? Well, of course, the conclusion has to be valid. No, what has to be valid for the conclusion to be correct? You're right. Number one, the minor premise has to be valid. Number two, the major premise has to be valid. Number three,
The major premise should cover the first one.
right. So basically what you're saying to me is that the predicate in the minor premise should be repeated as the subject of the major premise, meaning that the form of the argument has to be valid. Not only the content of the argument has to be valid, but the form of the argument, the surah of the argument has to be valid as well, right? A is B, B is C, therefore A is C, right? Because I could come and say, hey, look, Socrates is mortal, Socrates is a human being, Socrates is Greek, therefore all human beings are Greek. Would that be valid? No. Why not? My major premise is correct, my minor premise is correct. What's wrong with the argument? The form of the argument is not right. Right? I went A is B, A is C, therefore B is C. That form is not correct. Okay? Therefore, for this argument to be valid, 1, minor premise, 2, major premise, 3, form of the argument. Once the form of the argument is valid, the conclusion follows. Whether you like it or you don't like it, the conclusion follows from it. You cannot escape from it. I'm going to ask you one very difficult question now. How do I know the conclusion follows from it? How do you know if A is B and B is C, therefore A is C? Who said? you just enjoy playing with letters and it looks wonderful, so
Self-proven.
self-proven? Like you mean to tell me there's no argument to show me that this is a valid form of argument? I just have to accept it like that?
It's, I think, basic assumption.
It's a basic assumption. Anybody else?
What's this?
Right. So you're going down the right lane. These are the answers that I wanted to hear from you. I will demonstrate a little later that, look, you have to accept that there are certain premises and there are certain prepositions which cannot be proven. They just have to be accepted, right? It has to, like the whole chain of argument has to end somewhere and it has to start somewhere where that premise no longer requires any proving by itself, okay? So Aristotle, although he tried very hard to show that, look, I have a proof for why this argument is correct. And if you think about it, all he's saying is that, look, this is a universal statement. This is an example or an instance of the universal. Therefore, whatever is true of the universal is also true of an instance of it as well, okay? It's very straightforward, but we're going to end up saying that this is one of the badihiyat, one of the self-proven, or one of the primary principles that we're going to accept. But now here is, I'm sorry I'm pushing you a little too much today. I hope you're okay with that. Now we've been talking about what is mantiq, right? Mantiq talks about two things. First, it talks about different forms which are valid, which forms are valid, and which forms are not valid. So for example, when I was studying this book of Mantiq, al-Muzaffar in the seminary, it has 3 parts of it. The first 2 parts, or the second part, a thick section of it, simply talks about, I think, 16 different forms. Which ones of them are valid, which ones of them are not valid, okay? That's a discussion on forms. Mantiq rises to the occasion and helps you to discern which are correct forms, which are not correct forms. But there is also a discussion on the content as well. Which content is valid, which substances are valid, which are not valid. And it's not mantiq, although it's discussed in mantiq, it's not mantiq that answers these questions, it is epistemology that answers these questions. It is the theory of knowledge that answers this question. It is ma'rifat shanasi that answers these questions. And ma'rifat shanasi is one of those very important discussions, philosophical, proper, that a person has to have a grapple over before they can start, answering some of the difficult questions about the existence of God. It's one of those questions or one of those sciences that even precedes, just like mantiq will precede, for example, a discussion on theology, on kalam, and philosophy, epistemology also is one of those discussions that precedes all of the other discussions as well. I'm really surprised sometimes that members in the Muslim community, from different walks of life, from different denominations, sometimes look down upon philosophy, look down upon epistemology, look down upon the study of logic as well. I remember I was talking to somebody and they just asked me out of the blue, what do you study in the seminary? And I mentioned I study philosophy in the seminary, and they looked at me as if I performed a major sin or something, But my question is, when you're faced with such a question, such as agnosticism, and how do you know God exists or doesn't exist? And you have to run through this whole process of saying that, look, there are certain forms by which we prove certain conclusions. And to prove them, we have to show that their substances are valid substances and their forms are correct forms. How exactly am I going to do that if I have absolutely no idea of logic and I have absolutely no idea of epistemology either, right? I have to have some handle of the sciences. What is epistemology? The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, just to choose another encyclopedia besides Britannica, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it says epistemology, very simply put, is the study of knowledge and the study of justified beliefs. Doesn't mean too much to me. So let me put it into context for you. There's a scholar, a professor in Qom, Ustad Fayyazi. If you ever want to listen to lectures on philosophy, epistemology, and logic, Ustad Khayyasi is the one to listen to. A student of Ayatollah Jawadi and Ayatollah Misbah, both of them, and one of the leading philosophers right now. He's got this really wonderful book, which I'm not going to lend out to anybody. Dar Ahmadi Bar Ma'rifat Shanasi. It's in Farsi in any case. A series of lectures on Ma'rifat Shanasi. Okay? I think over there he puts it into a really good context. He says that, look, every field of study, every science has a subject of study, right? So for example, in mathematics, you study numbers, for example, all right? In sociology, you study human society, for example. In physics, you study particles, right? And if there was a study where the subject of study was knowledge itself, what would you call it? Epistemology. All right, very simple. Epistemology. So epistemology is that field of study where you take knowledge and you put it under the microscope, not the real Microsoft, but under the microscope, and you start studying it, and you say, well, what forms of knowledge do human beings have? What are valid forms of knowledge? How do we develop these forms of knowledge? Are they self-evident, or do they require some sort of, for example, rationalization? Can you associate a truth value to these forms of knowledge? Or can you not associate a truth value to these forms of knowledge? All these discussions, they fall under the study of epistemology. All right, coming back to the notes that you have in front of you. All right, it's very important that we engage in the study of epistemology. All right, it's important because we have to establish for ourselves that there are other sources of knowledge besides sensory data, besides what is understood by the 5 senses, okay? If you cannot establish for yourself that there are other sources of knowledge, that the human intellect is capable of deriving knowledge without using the 5 senses, then there is no hope in proving the existence of God. If that discussion is not open for you, there is no hope in proving the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because we know that God is not a physical being. When you're talking about the proofs for the existence of God, you're actually talking about proofs for the existence of a metaphysical being. All right? And that's been demonstrated in many of our ahadith and many of our traditions. One of the beautiful traditions that you have in front of you, so if I can just ask you to open up to page number 2. One of the most important discussions in epistemology is the truth value of prepositions and which prepositions are justified beliefs, or in other words, beliefs that conform with reality. In order to prove the existence of God, it is important to accept the truth value of prepositions which are purely intellectual and not necessarily sensorial. Science cannot prove the existence or the non-existence of God. I think we established this a month ago when we had our previous session. Science is the study of physical phenomena, their causes and their effects. Science may be required to prove the existence of God, but in and of itself is not adequate to prove the existence of God. The discussion on God is a discussion on the existence of a non-physical being. This has been captured in the traditions from the Ahlul Bayt. So for example, the 6th Holy Imam, he had a companion by the name of Hisham ibn al-Hakam. So Hisham says to him, I was actually arguing with a Zindiq. A Zindiq is an atheist. And these were the arguments of the atheist. And the atheist said, well, if your God is not a physical being, then how can he exist? Things that exist have to be physical. The 6th Imam said to him, he is a thing with the reality of things, meaning he is a shay, okay? He exists in the corporeal world. He is not just an image that exists in my mind, but at the same time, he is not a body, nor is he a form. He cannot be experienced sensorially, nor can he be felt, nor can he be comprehended by the 5 senses, nor can imagination capture him. One day a man came to Amir al-Mu'mineen and said to him, can you see God? And the Imam said to him, I do not worship a Lord that I cannot see. The Imam knew when he said that this person would think that God has a physical form and a physical being. The Imam said to him, but I don't see him with my eyes, rather I see him with the reality of the heart. Okay? He's not experienced by the senses, but he is experienced by the mind. We're talking about the mind right now. And at a higher stage, he is experienced by the heart as well. However, you have to accept that there can be other forms of knowledge which do not rely on human senses. Okay? Now, of course, I don't want to get into a discussion on mantiq or a discussion on epistemology, but I do want to point out one more thing before I bring it to the main question that I have for today, for you to think about, and for us to discuss in the coming weeks. And that is, look, in mantiq they say, or in epistemology they say, that the primary sources of knowledge which bring about certainty, which bring about justified belief. Because there are some sources of knowledge which don't bring about certainty. They bring about conjecture, they bring about doubts, they bring about possibilities. No, we want to talk about those sources of knowledge which bring about certainty. They place them at 5 or 6. Okay, I'm going to run through them very quickly, but I want to come back to the first one, because that first one will be very important for us. The first one, of course, is what are known as badihiyat or awaliyat, right? So, not in English. Primary sources, which we call them to be self-evident. The second one are things which are acquired by the senses. So for example, and these are, all the ones I'm listing right now, they don't require further proof. They are proven by themselves. So for example, when I look outside, I see it is bright. I say it is day. Or when I look outside, I say the sun is shining. Don't ask me for a proof for that, right? This is something my eyes see, and I'm just narrating to you what my eyes see. The third one is experimental. Or if I want to say maybe empirical, tajrubiyat. Okay. For example, every time I took a metal piece and I heated it, what happened to it? It expanded. Okay. Every time I did that, it expanded. I came to the conclusion based on empirical data that whenever you heat a piece of metal, it expands. You ask me for a proof why it expands, well, that's what I see. It happens every time. Every time I did it, it happened. I came to the conclusion that whenever you heat a piece of metal, it expands. The fourth one is through what is known as intuitive, or unanimous, mutawatirat. How many of you have been to South America? How do you know South America exists? You haven't seen it. How do you know it exists? Everybody says so. So what if everybody says so? Huh? Right? So, after a while it becomes unanimous, right? One person walks in, independent people come in. One person walks in, do you know there was an accident outside near the engineering building? I say, well, maybe it's true, maybe it's false, I don't know. Another person walks in, nothing to do with the first person, comes and tells me the same thing. Do you know there was an accident over there? By the time the fifth person walks in, I'm pretty sure that there's an accident over there. Why? Did I see it myself? No. Did I experiment with it? No. Is it something that's self-evident to me? No, it's not. But it is because it was unanimous. 5, intuitive. There's some things that we just simply look at it and your intuition tells you, hey, this is how it's supposed to be. They say Khwaja Nasiruddin at-Tusi, he built an observatory in Murtaza. Murtaza is in Turkey, okay? In Iran, is it? Of course, the Iranians would say it's in Iran. Is it in Iran? North Iran? Okay, all right. So, anyways, so when I read historical texts, they mention Turkey, but I guess now it's become part of Iran. All right. So, he built it in Iran. And you know who he got to pay for the observatory, right? The Mongols, right? The Mongols that burnt down the library in Baghdad. He got them to pay for the observatory. A very politically astute person. So Khaja Nasiruddin Tusi, it is said, for example, from the observatory, when he would look out at sea, right, or from somewhere else, I'm not sure if it was from the observatory now or from somewhere else, he would look out at sea, he would notice that when the ships were coming in, first you could see their mast, then slowly you started seeing the bottom of the body, and then you saw the hull of the body, right? And he realized from that it would seem that the earth is curved and the earth is not flat. Because if the earth was flat, when the ships came in, you would see the ship, the entire ship, small, and then as it came closer, you'd see the whole ship. But when he looked out, he didn't see it that way. He saw the mast first, and then he saw the rest of the ship, and he realized it is having a curvature, and it's coming up. Now, he came to the conclusion, or it is said he came to the conclusion, that the earth had a curvature. What was that based on? Did he experiment it? No, he didn't experiment it. Did he sense it? Well, sensing is not enough to come up with that conclusion, right? It was intuitive. And the last thing is known as fitriyat, or things which are innate. There is a difference between things which are innate and things which are self-evident. I don't want to get lost in that discussion, all right? Now, coming back to things which are self-evident, awwaliyat, right? These are prepositions. When you look at these prepositions, you realize that I don't need any further argument to understand the truth value of these prepositions. I verify these prepositions, right? By looking at the subject and looking at the predicate, you accept the preposition. For example, the whole is always greater than its parts. Do you have an argument for that? No, you don't have an argument for that. You know, it is self-evident to you that the whole always has to be greater than its parts. Or, for example, the law of contradictories. You know what the law of contradictories is? Two opposite contradictory arguments cannot both be right at the same time from the same sense or from the same perspective, right? Do you have an argument for that? No, you don't have an argument for that. It is something which is, by definition, it's self-evident. You simply have to think about it. Think of the subject, think of the predicate, and the rest just falls into place. Doesn't need any other argument for it. Or, for example, the fact that the simplest form of a qiyas, of a syllogism, gives you the right answer, and you can accept that answer. Do I have an argument for that? I don't have an argument for that, but it is self-evident to me that the answer, the conclusion that you draw from it is a correct conclusion. All right. Now, one of the arguments for the existence of God, now my discussion for today has come to an end. I'm just leading up to the discussion for next month. And it's something that I want you to think about. And guess what? You have a whole month to think about it. So one thing that I would like you to think about is this. One of the arguments for the existence of God is a very simple argument. It's a syllogism that goes this way. It says that, look, the universe is a design structure. All right. All design structures what do they need? Need what?
Create.
Not a designer, but need a conscious or a sentient designer. Even an atheist believes that the universe has a designer. He just calls it Mother Nature. But we want to believe that designer is a sentient designer. Meaning it's something that has a will of its own, a knowledge, a conscious of its own. It makes decision on its own. It's not just like a mechanism that's in place. And therefore the conclusion is that the universe has a sentient designer. Okay. For this argument to be valid, what has to be valid? Just run me through it. It's obvious. The minor premise has to be valid, so I have to demonstrate it. I can't just come and prove this, or just come and claim this. And especially what I have to do is I have to define what a design structure is. I have to demonstrate that there are design structures in the universe. Secondly, I have to prove the major premise as well, that all design structures need a sentient designer. I can't just come and claim that. And then the form of the argument. So I have repeated the B over here. If A is B and B needs C, therefore A needs C. Okay, the form of the argument is correct, and I accept that any argument of this form has a truth value to it. Therefore, my conclusion has a truth value to it. So all I need to do is actually prove the minor premise and the major premise. Then whether you like the conclusion or you don't like the conclusion, you have to accept the conclusion. Now, it comes to this major premise. That's where Hume came and attacked this particular argument. It's very important. I know many of us know Burhan and Nazm, but do you know Burhan and Nazm in this particular manner? It's important. Sometimes somebody comes and criticizes the Burhan, you don't know where does he have the problem. Is it in the minor premise? Can he not see the design? Is it in the major premise? Can he not see this universal principle? Or is it in the form of the argument? If you understand where the problem is, you can treat it right where he is. Well, Hume, in all that work that you read, you probably would not be able to tell, but Hume had a problem with the major premise. And the major premise was that all design structures need a sentient designer. Now, most of us, we accept this argument. In fact, the narration that I read for you from Imam as-Sadiq, the Imam says to Hisham, "Oh Hisham, don't you see that when you look at a structure, right, even after the person who has built it has gone away and he's not there and you can't see that person, but when you look at the structure, don't you realize that somebody had built this structure once upon a time? That there was a person who came and fashioned and designed this structure?" And Hisham says, "Yes, I accept that," right? We all accept. The best example given for this is the watchmaker example, right? Whenever you look at a watch, you realize that there was a watchmaker to it, okay? Something which is obvious to you. Hume says there's a problem with that argument. The problem is that this argument is based on experimental or empirical data. You looked at all the things which were visible to you, like an iPhone and an iPad and a watch and the light bulbs and all other design structures which human being made, and you realized each and every time that anytime something was made, there had to be a designer to it. So you also made that jump and you assumed that, you know what, if there is a nature and there is a world, then there has to be a designer to it. But your data or your subset is not sufficient for you to make this conclusion. So let's read through it. If you can just bear with me. So this preamble for next session comes from Wikipedia. All right. Hume gave the classic criticism of the design argument in his book, whatever that book is called. He argued that for the design argument to be feasible, it must be true that order and purpose are observed only when they result from design. But order is observed regularly, resulting from presumably mindless processes like snowflake or crystal generation. Design, now here's where I really want your attention, accounts for only a tiny part of our experience with order and purpose. Furthermore, the design argument is based on an incomplete analogy. Because of our experience with objects, we can recognize human-designed ones, comparing, for example, a pile of stones and a brick wall. But to point to a designed universe, we would need to have an experience of a range of different universes. As we only experience one, the analogy cannot be applied. The analogy is insufficient. Your major premise is deeply flawed, and therefore your conclusion is not valid. Do you understand what his argument is? He's saying you don't have a big enough range of data to be able to draw this conclusion. Yes, you can draw this conclusion for human-made objects, but you cannot draw this conclusion for natural objects or the natural world. To be able to draw this conclusion for the natural world, you have to have, let's say, 1,000 universes. In each universe, you see that design only comes into being when there is a sentient designer, and then, and only then, can you come and claim that this universe, or all design structures in this universe, need a sentient designer. That's a powerful argument against, the argument by design. So how are you going to deal with it?
The answer, I guess, is how do we know a structure is designed? So we compare it with something in this world that we think it's not designed. So you might say that in this world, you see some stuff that have a less, like lower amount of designedness.
Yes.
And then with comparing those, you can see that what design means.
Right.
So in that sense, yeah, like you can see that what a human has made,
Yes.
what's the difference of that with something that human hasn't touched upon it.
Right.
So based on that, you can have an idea of design. Now, when you see that some of the things that are, for example, human itself or
Yes.
the creatures have that notion of sort of order and thing in them that
Yes.
is compared to other stuff in
Yes.
this world
Yes.
that has a more complexity.
Yes.
So then you can have this idea that something is designed.
Yeah, but I guess what he's trying to say is that, the things that we human beings made, it is not natural for example, a piece of silicon to become an IC. All right, it's not natural for it to become like that. But when you look at the universe, the things like a tree, it is natural, for example, for a seed to become a tree. Or it is natural, for example, for a process of evolution to come into place. All right? Only if you look at other natural processes and other natural phenomena, and in all of those you can demonstrate that they could not have come into being unless there was a sentient designer, then only I will accept that this universe has a
Okay,
sentient
there's some,
designer.
like in the thermodynamics, we say in the second law that
Yes.
things go towards
Chaos.
maximum, chaos.
Right.
So now, in that sense, if you see that some other things haven't gone into chaos,
Right.
so that might be. If I want to.
I don't know. Maybe there were a million universes. All of them went into chaos, and this one worked out.
Yeah, the thing is, I think one
Yes.
criticism can be made about this,
Yes.
that this is based on istiqra, or
Okay.
so the premises are based on that.
Yes.
And yes, like based on that, you cannot make a claim of all things.
Okay.
But it comes down to like in our humane,
Yeah.
most of the things probably.
Okay.
And that in my,
Yeah.
I don't think that this is the strongest proof of God.
Okay.
But I think that leads you to some sort of idea that there is a very good chance that there might be a designer. So in that sense, it's defensive, but with all,
Yeah, so the universe probably has a sentient designer. There's a 90% chance or 95% chance has a sentient designer. And I'm a gambling person, I'll gamble on the 95%. But I can't say with certainty, based on this argument, and you're right, based on this argument, that the universe has a sentient designer. Because this major premise that I have is based on istiqra, or based on, if you want to say, empirical data or empiricism, and I don't have a big enough set of data to study from.
I think the problem
So you mean
is
to tell me that the most important argument, in Islamic theology, this is the most important
Is
argument.
it the most important about the Quran?
That's an argument produced by the philosophers. But the mutakallimin, for example, especially those who don't have a philosophical leaning, they would not turn to that. In the Quran, for example, that which is most obvious, or the one that is referred to in the ahadith as well, the one which is apparently referred to in the hadith as well, is the argument by design, right? And you're trying to tell me that there's a deep flaw in this argument?
I think that after all,
Yes.
you have this, and if you think that, okay, there's a high probability that there is God, and your whole picture of things, if that works out in that whole picture, then you
Yes.
accept. But
Okay.
if you say there is nothing, and no created.
Okay.
And when you have many other problems,
Yes.
then that's the reason that you don't accept that part.
Okay. So then what you're saying to me right now is that the argument by design in and of itself is not sufficient. But if you add other things to it, other pieces of evidence to it, eventually, it brings about 99.99999% certainty.
So like the assumptions, for example,
Yes.
that you have in many parts of science.
Yes.
You assume that, for example, light is photon and something like that, and you produce
Yes.
theories based on that. If they
Yes.
work out, then you say, maybe our assumptions were wrong.
Right. So, sure.
The answer comes from the epistemology.
Yes.
And the problem is for the first minor sentences.
Oh, for the problem with
Yes.
the minor premise?
Yes.
Okay, what's the problem with the minor premise?
There is no problem with the first sentence, but the Hume has a problem with the first sentence.
Oh, he has a problem with the first sentence?
Yes.
Oh, okay. In what sense does Hume have a problem with the first sentence?
Really, I forgot the answer.
So-
I know
Okay.
that the problem, and
No,
I know that the
Hume-
answer comes from the epistemology.
No, for example, Hume says that sometimes you see design structure in the universe without any particular sentient designer getting involved in that process. So, for example, he says, look at a snowflake.
Mhm.
A snowflake, you agree it's designed, or it looks like a designed structure, but there is no person, consciously or sentiently getting involved in making the snowflake. So he accepts that there are design structures in the universe. He just doesn't accept that it needs a sentient designer. So I'm not going to answer this question today. I'm going to let it, simmer through, and you guys can think about it. The answer actually for me came from Shahid Murtaza. Powerful answer, and you have
In the book of Shanacht Shanasi.
not
Masale
Shanasi. No, actually materialism. Why the
Oh,
West
materialism.
gravitates towards materialism. So because it's a very materialistic view of the world. But anyways, a powerful response. And it comes back to those 6 things that we mentioned, and it comes back to epistemology, and it shows you the importance of the study of epistemology in even some of the most basic arguments that we have. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.